Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and it's always so great to spend this time with you. On today's show, history is being made on multiple fronts. We have a $1 trillion IPO, the first ever trillionaire is named, and a possible Middle East peace deal. And the biggest World Cup starts on Canadian soil today, and the White House hosts a UFC fight. Now, the world's richest private company has officially gone public. SpaceX has launched a record-breaking $75 billion IPO, instantly becoming one of the most valuable companies on Earth, also making Elon Musk the world's first trillionaire. And this is the beginning of a new era for space, technology, and artificial intelligence. Stay tuned for those details. And on the other headlines we have today will be a possible breakthrough in the Middle East conflict as the United States and Iran appear closer than ever for a peace agreement, with reports suggesting a deal that could be signed within days as early as this weekend in Geneva. But while President Trump says the war is over, Tehran says not so fast. And Prime Minister Mark Carney is in Paris today, meeting with French President Macron ahead of the high-stakes G7 summit next week as trade tensions, issues on China, critical minerals, and the future of Kuzma will dominate the agenda for the Prime Minister. And we'll also examine a major court victory for President Trump's global 10% tariff strategy. And we have the latest numbers on Alberta's economy, which is outperforming recession expectations. You want to stay in tune for those numbers. And we'll also remember Brampton-born OPP Constable Tarun Bali, whose death is in line of duty, has brought communities across Ontario together in a tribute. And also, a historic UFC fight is set for the White House lawn this weekend. And in Toronto, the world is watching. Canada opens its FIFA World Cup campaign on home soil in the biggest sporting event our country has ever hosted. All this and much more right now on Ymedia Newsroom. So, starting with our top story, we have SpaceX that has officially debuted on the public market on June 12th, this morning, AM, in what is being described as the largest IPO in history. The company has raised approximately $75 billion, which would mean $135 per share, giving it a market valuation of roughly 1.75 to 1.77 trillion dollars, American dollars. And the offering has attracted enormous investors' demand and instantly became one of the most significant events in modern financial markets. More than 4,400 SpaceX employees are expected to become millionaires through stock ownership. And Elon Musk himself has officially become the world's first trillionaire, reaching an estimated net worth of over $1.1 trillion. This historic milestone was driven by the blockbuster initial public offering of his aerospace company, SpaceX, which debuted on the stock market at a valuation of $1.77 trillion. We're going to show you the video in the background of him in the stock market today in the stock exchange where he is celebrated. Everyone's clapping. This is huge news as he rings the bell. The company remains unprofitable despite its massive valuation, reportedly roughly $18.7 billion in revenue and an operating loss exceeding $4 billion just last year. But SpaceX business can include reusable rockets, Starlink satellite internet, government launched contracts, and AI-related ventures tied to Elon Musk's broader technology ecosystem. All this is expected in its first day premium up to 30% according to pre-IPO futures market. Here you have for our viewers showing Elon Musk today this morning announcing this biggest IPO ever. And it's about far more than just rockets, of course. When you think about SpaceX, investors are effectively betting on three mega trends at once. You have space infrastructure, you have satellite communications, and artificial intelligence. And SpaceX has become the backbone of much of America's launch capabilities, while Starlink has emerged as one of the world's largest satellite internet networks. And this valuation raises serious questions still. At nearly $1.8 trillion, investors are paying for what would be a future dominance rather than the current profits, as the company's not yet profitable. The enthusiasm resembles previous technology booms where markets reward companies for their long-term potential, for the long-term vision, essentially, and buying in early at what they expect the company to be valued in the future. Now, if SpaceX is successful and expands Starlink, AI infrastructure, and a future-based computing projects, then today's valuation may look justified. But if growth slows down, investors could face a significant downside risk. So this is massive, as the latest development is suggesting that, we're watching this. This today is history, with SpaceX making this enormous debut in the stock market. And there's latest development that suggests, which is big news now past the 100-day mark, that the United States and Iran conflict may be approaching a diplomatic turning point. But what's significant is that there's still some uncertainty around this peace deal. You have President Trump that says the peace deal could be signed within days, as early as this weekend on Sunday in Geneva, and has canceled his planned military strikes on Iran. We covered this all in detail yesterday, as we've seen the progress in the last 48 to 72 hours. Now, while Iran insists no final deal has been reached, it does say that it has come to an understanding on this memorandum of understanding on this peace deal. So now the military incidents continued in the region, and we're still seeing that Israel appears weary of this emerging U.S.-Iran negotiations, which it's been left out of. Essentially, if you recall, just 24 hours ago, President Trump said that he is going to strike Iran and its infrastructure, take over Kark Island, and it seemed like we were going into a full-blown war again since the ceasefire on April 8th. And now then there was a massive U-turn just hours later saying that, okay, you know what, there's going to be a peace deal, the strikes are canceled. So essentially the US went a diplomatic route. Meanwhile, Israel, was expecting that it was going to go into full escalation war again. Now, President Trump says that the peace memorandum between the United States and Iran could be signed within days. So we're watching this. Of course, we're going to cover this for you this weekend, as many big events are taking place this weekend. Now, first, Iran publicly did push back, stating that there was no final agreement that's been reached despite progress in negotiations. It did say that, it's going to negotiate with the United States, but it doesn't mean that it's, the final terms on its nuclear activity and every other point that it had raised for this peace deal. Now, the planned U.S. military strikes that were reportedly canceled because the diplomacy gained momentum, President Trump said, this is just the way forward. We're going to go to a quick video for President Trump where he announces of this massive diplomacy between U.S. and Iran. Take a look. Okay, I guess while we have the video, we'll cue it up. Anyway, so the proposed framework.
Hello, everybody. Just had a big day. I know you'll never be satisfied, but that's okay. That doesn't bother me at all. We just made a great settlement of the war with Iran, and we're going to be subject to finalization of documents, which should get done over the next few days. We'll probably have a signing maybe in Europe, and it's a great thing. Stock market's up 1,000 points. That means they like the deal. See, that means they like. If the market goes down, that means they don't like the deal. But it's been up, oil's dropped, oil will start coming down. And most importantly, we have a deal that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, which was the whole purpose of what we had to go through to get this. So it was a big, very big thing. But we have a signing soon, and the documents are in pretty final shape. So we'll see. We'll see.
You said this was just a concept of that agreement. So is this just essentially setting the stage for deeper talks on nuclear?
It's a very strong memorandum of understanding. That is a little conceptual, but it's something that's going to get done. And if it doesn't get done for any reason, which I can't imagine that not happening, they want to sign it as much as I do or more. I would say they want to sign it more, maybe a lot more. But it's a very detailed memorandum of understanding, also agreed to by many other countries that have great influence over them, and everybody wants it done. So it's going to get done.
There you have it. That's the president talking about this diplomacy agreement, an MOU with Iran for end of the war. Now, the proposed framework reportedly includes sanction relief, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and potentially releases of frozen Iranian assets and future nuclear talks. Israel is not party to the negotiations, and reports suggest that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was not fully briefed before the United States shifted towards diplomacy, right before it was saying that it was going to go pretty much full on war with Iran. Now, despite negotiations, you have military tensions that still remain in the region, and the US has reportedly intercepted Iranian drones, and Iran has seized shipping vessels. And the Israeli operation in Lebanon is still continuing. Now, where are the stats on this war that started on February 28th that turned into peace talks, that turned into stale peace talks, that turned into an eruption between Israel and Iran, and then Iran and the United States? Well, this war duration was more than 3 months since the fighting escalated at the end of February, and the proposed Iranian reconstruction package could be approximately $300 billion. And in that time frame, we saw oil prices jump to over $100 per barrel. At the height, it was $117 per barrel. Now, oil prices roughly fell 2% on the hopes of this diplomatic breakthrough. So it's massive as the markets react immediately to all these headlines. And a bipartisan U.S. House resolution moved to limit further military action against Iran, highlighting a growing political pressure in Washington, D.C. to end this war and have an off-ramp. So you have this potential breakthrough in the U.S.-Iran conflict appearing closer than any other point since this crisis began at the end of February. Now, America and the American and Iranian negotiators have agreed on the text of the interim memorandum of understanding that would extend the ceasefire, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and launch formal negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. However, the agreement still requires final approval from both governments. We're seeing this take place as US and Iranian negotiators have reportedly agreed on the text of this MOU, and the proposed deal would extend the ceasefire. So we're watching this carefully. We're going to let you know because President Trump says there will be a signing ceremony that could take place this Sunday in Geneva, Switzerland. And as this is a developing story, as it's changing moment by moment, we'll bring you the latest as it develops. Now, this is important because, the next 48 to 72 hours will be critical to watch how this plays out. And hopefully this will go into a final phase and not escalate as we've seen take place in the last, 3 months. Now, a U.S. federal judge has indefinitely blocked President Trump's controversial $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund. This is delivering a significant legal setback to the president and his initiative that had, drawn a lot of criticisms from the Democrat side as well as Republicans. The judge ordered that the administration to provide a sworn statement within a week confirming that the funds, the $1.8 billion fund, will not move forward while the legal challenge continues. So this is U.S. District Judge Leona Brinkemia. She issued a preliminary injunction, essentially effectively freezing the fund indefinitely. The fund was valued at $1.8 billion, and it was intended to compensate individuals who claimed that they were victims of government weaponization or that it was a case where it was politically motivated prosecutions against them. Now, the proposal emerged from what was a settlement in a lawsuit involving President Trump's lawsuit against the IRS over leak tax return information. And that drew a lot of criticism because given that Donald Trump is the president of the United States, it was the president of the United States suing the IRS. So it was as if the government was suing the government, and then therefore the settlement came out of the $1.8 billion. And a lot of people said, well, wait a minute, was, first of all, government can't sue itself, but was it all just set up so there would be a $1.8 billion fund for this weaponization fund? So that had a lot of criticism, especially also from the Republicans as well. Now, the Justice Department that inked this deal on behalf of the president with the IRS previously indicated the administration was moving away from the plan after bipartisan opposition in Congress. And then that flipped again, saying that they're going to continue forward. And now the judge has made its final verdict on this case. Now, critics argue that the fund could improperly benefit President Trump's allies, including some of the January 6 defendants, and mount to an unconstitutional political slush fund, essentially paid for by taxpayers. Now, despite statements that the fund was being abandoned, the judge ruled that there was insufficient assurance that it could not be revived later. Now, this case has become a broader battle over presidential powers, the government's accountability, and the use of public funds, taxpayer dollars. Even some Republicans opposed the proposal, fearing it would create the appearance of essentially rewarding political supporters with taxpayer money. Taxpayer money should be going for, the investment back into the country, not necessarily as a slush fund for, people that support the president, for example. So the controversy also exposed a rare tension between what would be President Trump and congressional Republicans who reportedly pressured the White House to abandon the fund. It is not good, especially it's also midterms in November, and the primaries are taking place right now. So this is something that Congress is very mindful of when it comes to the Republican Party. Now, politically, this is less about money and more about what would be credibility, accountability, not to be corrupt. The administration had already suggested the fund was effectively dead, yet the judge still felt compelled to issue an injunction. This signals that the court was not satisfied with the informal assurance and wanted legally binding commitment from this administration. Now, this ruling is also notable because it reflects resistance from both Democrats and Republicans. In today's polarized political environment, you have bipartisan opposition, which is very rare. The only other time we saw that happen was about Jeffrey Epstein and opening up his list, right? And what came out as the 3 million pages of documents. And that was, again, another bipartisan move. Now, this episode shows that there's still limits to how far executive powers can go when it comes to the president's powers and what it means for lawmakers and when it comes to the judicial system in America. So now the U.S. Federal Appeals Court has handed this news to President Trump. And at the same time, as he has this blow on the 1.8 weaponization fund, he has what you could consider a slight victory. In this case, you have the U.S. Federal Appeal Court has handed President Trump a significant legal victory by allowing his administration to continue collecting its 10% global tariff while a broader legal challenge moves through the court system. So if you recall, President Trump said that he's going to put out a 10% tariff globally, regardless of trade agreements he has with different countries, right? So here you have that this court ruling does not settle the case permanently, but it means that the tariffs remain in force for now, preserving what would be a key pillar of President Trump's trade agenda. So what is this exactly about? You have the U.S. Court of Appeal for the Federal Circuit ruled that the Trump administration can continue collecting its 10% tariffs while the appeals proceed. Now, the tariff applies broadly to imports from virtually every country, regardless of a trade agreement. The appeals court indicated that the administration's legal arguments are likely strong enough to justify keeping the tariffs in place during litigation. Now, that's a little bit tricky because given if the outcome of this trial would be that the 10% tariffs are not legal, then they have to go through a mechanism of repaying that back. But for now, it looks like it's proceeding. Now, a lower trade court had previously ruled the tariffs unlawful and ordered the relief for some importers. If the tariffs is ultimately struck down, which it may happen, importers could receive refunds with interest. So this is going to be a very sticky situation with administration and to be able to go through this process. But yet, when it comes to this legal battle that stemmed from President Trump's use of Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, after the Supreme Court earlier ruled that the emergency powers under this under the IEEPA could not be used to impose broad tariffs like this, just broad 10% on every country. Now, the maximum tariff authority under Section 122 is about 15% for up to 150 days. A coalition challenging this tariff is of 24 states came together to challenge this. And if you take a look at it, I mean, if you consider that it does affect the states that have these trade agreements with, for example, the states that have trade agreements with Canadian provinces. And then when you have this broad 10% on for any, for tariffs just generally, then it affects those. So then you had the 24 states actually, create a coalition, challenge President Trump's tariffs. And right now, this is still in litigation, but the current tariff expiration date will be July 24th of this year, unless it's extended or replaced based on how this goes. Now, Canada does remain one of America's largest trading partners with hundreds of billions of dollars in annual cross-border trade. So this is very significant because any legal decision that strengthens or weakens this 10% blanket tariff could affect future negotiations over CUSMA, whether it's automotive manufacturing, steel, aluminum, agriculture, or energy exports. So the ruling also comes just weeks before what we're watching and this countdown to this CUSMA trade review that is scheduled for July 1st. Of course, we are going to keep you up to date to let you know what it means for Canadians. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney is holding a series of high-level meetings with G7 allies ahead of next week's summit in France, with topics such as trade, China, critical minerals, tariffs, and global economic security expected to dominate discussions. Today, Prime Minister Carney is meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris before the G7 summit. And this is a time where Canada is navigating very delicate situation balancing act while it's maintaining access to the US markets. It also wants to expand its trade relationships in Europe and Asia. Now, this trade diversification is very significant for Canada because currently 70% of Canadian exports go to the United States, right? And that's why the CUSMA review is very critical for Canada on July 1st. And while Canada is preparing its crucial CUSMA review talks, this is at the same time as President Trump just announced that he's not going to renew CUSMA. We covered that for you in detail earlier this week. The other topic that will be, top of mind during the G7 summit is China. China is expected to be one of the most contentious topics at the G7, particularly regarding trade imbalances, critical minerals, EVs. China right now dominates 60% of the electrical vehicle market and industrial overcapacity. Now you have European allies that are increasingly concerned about Chinese exports flooding global markets, while Canada continues to pursue a pragmatic economic relationship with Beijing as its second biggest trading partner. And when it comes to the G7 agenda, it's also expected to focus heavily on Ukraine, the Middle East tensions, critical minerals, and supply chain securities. And if this MOU between United States and Iran is signed in Geneva on Sunday, well, that would be majorly taken care of before the G7 summit. Now, I do want to tell you that our colleague Shubi is going to be at the G7. He's going to be covering the event. He will be boarding the Prime Minister's plane in Geneva and landing in Evian, which is where the summit will be held. Aside from asking questions from these world leaders, he's going to show you the background of where the summit's being held. So we're going to go live with him next week and get all the coverage firsthand here at Ymedia. So it's very critical that we're bringing this to you and we cover what is expected to be announced with these leaders. Now, why this is so significant is because the G7 economies still account for roughly 40% of the global GDP, despite representing a shrinking share of the world's population. So we're going to be watching when it comes to critical minerals. That has now emerged as one of the top strategic priorities heading into the summit, right? When you look at what Canada is doing, Canada is trying to position itself as a balanced power, a middle power that is going to grow its relationship not only with China, with the European Union countries, the other G7 countries, meanwhile balancing its relationship with the United States, as it's very critical. Now, a growing number of NATO military planners and intelligence officials believe that the alliance has only a few years to prepare for a potential confrontation with Russia after the war in Ukraine. There's been warnings from Germany and other NATO members that Russia could rebuild enough military capability to threaten NATO territories by the end of this decade, prompting an accelerated, what would be an effort across Europe to boost defense spending and military readiness. We are watching all these countries massively spend on arming themselves. And when it comes to NATO allies, they're increasing their focus on what would mean between the potential Russian threat beyond this war with Ukraine, with some intelligence assessments pointing to a potential risk window around 2029 and 2030. Now, Germany is leading a major military buildup and has warned that Russia could reconstitute a significant combat capability within a few years after the Ukraine war. And this signals if they believe that the Ukraine war will come to an end and therefore Russia will get a chance to, be able to regather and regroup and target NATO at large. So now Canada is facing growing pressures from its allies to modernize its military, to strengthen its Arctic defenses, and expand its contributions to the NATO operations. NATO is reinforcing its eastern flank, including deployments in the Baltic region, where Canada continues to play a leadership role through its mission in Latvia. Now, defense planners are increasingly focused on air defense, missile defense, cyber warfare, space security, drones, and Arctic sovereignty. Now, the NATO current defense spending target is 2% of GDP. Canada's defense spending has historically been lower than the target amount, about 1.4%. But now Ottawa has reached its 2% target, with Prime Minister Mark Carney saying that he's going to go up to 4% by 2030. So we're looking at, just around the corner. He's going to double that percentage in NATO's spending, 4% of GDP. Now, Canada leads NATO's multinational battle group in Latvia as a part of the alliance Eastern deterrence strategy. So when you have Russia that has repeatedly used nuclear, rhetoric during the Ukraine war, with Ukrainian officials telling Canadian parliamentarians that Moscow has issued dozens of nuclear threats since 2022, this is becoming a bigger concern for NATO in general. Now, the debate is no longer just about helping Ukraine, even though Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky will be at the G7 next week. It seems that it's NATO's concern is about what's happening after the war with Ukraine. So if Russia rebuilds its military, Canada could face demands for higher defense spending, expanding Arctic military infrastructure, more troops deployed overseas, new missile defenses and air defense systems, greater cooperation with Eastern allies on weapons production and military procurement. The Arctic is becoming especially important as Russia expands its northern military footprint. And we've heard the same with China also expanding its military footprint in the Arctic. So now NATO is seeking to secure its northern flank. Now, the most important takeaway is that NATO leaders are preparing for a world in which Ukraine war may not be the end of the security challenges posed by Russia. Whether Russia would actually attack NATO territories, I think that's highly debatable. And but the alliance is creating the strategy is based on what would be deterrence, right? They want to make it appear that for Moscow never to believe that it could succeed. And so therefore you're seeing Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states and the Nordic countries are arming up and essentially putting that as the forefront. And so for Canada, the issue is becoming harder to avoid because you have successive governments have delayed major military investments, but NATO's security environment is changing rapidly. The question is no longer whether Canada will spend more money on defense. Canada has currently done so, and it says it will continue to do so. But I guess the question remains on how quickly and where that money will be spent is going to be what we're going to be watching. Now, Alberta's economy is showing a surprising resilient despite trade uncertainty with the United States and what it comes as weak energy prices and concerns about tariffs. You have this coming out as a new report from the ATB Financial suggests that Alberta is likely to avoid recession in 2026. And this is supported by population growth, consumer spending, energy production, and ongoing investments in technology and petrochemicals. However, economists warn that growth will be slower than in recent years as global trade tensions and economic uncertainty weighs on business confidence. Alberta continues to attract investment in technology, artificial intelligence, petrochemicals, and renewable energy projects. Alberta's real GDP is projected to grow approximately 1.5% in 2026, down from stronger growth rates in previous years. Alberta added roughly 200,000 residents over the past year, one of the fastest growing growth rates in all of Canada. And the population growth remains one of Alberta's biggest economic drivers. And you have oil and gas productions that remain strong despite price volatility. So now the province continues to produce more than 4 million barrels of oil per day, making it Canada's energy powerhouse, of course. And Alberta's unemployment rate remains below the national average, and interprovincial migration into Alberta remains among the strongest in the country. So, why does this matter? The report reinforces the growing economic divide within Canada. While parts of central Canada face recession concerns, Alberta continues to benefit from energy exports, population inflows, housing demand, and business investment. Now, the province has become a magnet for Canadians seeking lower housing costs, higher wages, and employment opportunities. And this is happening at the same time where you're seeing that the federal government is trying to work very close with Alberta while we're seeing this rise in this separatist movement in Alberta. So this is very interesting at a time where Alberta seems to be prospering compared to all the other provinces in Canada. There is still a momentum with this separatist movement that is growing. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to be right back. I guess we're not taking a break. We'll continue. Okay. So now one of the most important takeaway is that Alberta's economy is becoming more diversified without abandoning its energy roots. So for years, Alberta's fortunes rose and fell entirely when it comes to oil prices. But what you're seeing today, it's a little bit different. You have energy remaining dominant, but growth is increasingly coming from other sectors like technology, AI, infrastructure, petroleum, logistics, and manufacturing. So the biggest risk here remains external. If the United States tariff expands, global trade slows, or oil prices weaken significantly, you have Alberta would feel the impact quickly. But compared with many other provinces, Alberta enters a second half of 2026 with a position of relative strength. So, at a time where economists are debating whether Canada is in a recession, Alberta's economy is proving evidence and providing evidence that it can grow. And that is happening at a time where, you're seeing that Alberta is doing quite well as it's diversified. And then there's the whole conversation of the referendum. And we're going to take a quick break and we're going to be right back. Thank you so much.